I think it's a perfect time to have a talk by Reverend Emily McNeill. She is an executive director of New York State Labor Religion Coalition and Poor People's Campaign. Given her commitment to build a more just and equitable world by addressing social, economic, and racial justice, we are very lucky to have her talk about building a movement to end poverty.
Thank you. I think I have, yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. It is really wonderful to be with you all. My background coming into this work is in both ministry and organizing. I'm a minister in the United Church of Christ and currently direct the Labor Religion Coalition of New York State. And we work statewide, but are based, oh, awesome, thank you. We are based in Albany, and our mission is to bring together organized labor and faith and community in a statewide movement to address racial, social, and economic justice. And for that movement to be drawing on and grounded in the values that we hold, whether those are values rooted in faith traditions or, our political traditions or anything. And a lot of the work that we've been doing in the last couple years is on building up the Poor People's Campaign in New York State, which is what I'm going to talk about. And there's also a bunch of folks in the room who have been part of that in this part of the state. And I hope they'll share some things as well. So most of us are here today because we're already convinced that poverty is a crisis in our city and our state and our country, and that it calls us to action. And we've gotten a little bit into the kind of policies and shifts that would be needed to make a difference in this area. And what I'm going to really delve into a bit more, and I'm glad that this has kind of already started to come up, is the question of how. How do those shifts happen in a way that makes what seems to be politically impossible now possible and even inevitable? And my perspective on this and the premise of this presentation is that a social movement is necessary to make this kind of change. In our country's history, major systemic changes like ending slavery and giving women the right to vote and ending Jim Crow laws and winning the 8-hour workday, all were made possible by masses of people taking action together, often in ways, or always actually, in ways that were disruptive, that at first were seen as very unrealistic and radical, but created the conditions through which legislative and policy changes could happen. And what we're facing, the kinds of things that we've just heard about, is the kind of change that will also require a kind of ambitious and radical movement that engages masses of people to confront all the political and economic obstacles that we've already talked about are currently in the way. When Dr. King was assassinated in 1968, he was working with others on a Poor People's Campaign, a movement that he wanted to see shift the country in much more dramatic ways even than it had been shifted in the civil rights movement. And I think this is a really important moment in history that a lot of us have not learned very much about. And so I want to start by talking a little bit more about that history and the lessons that come out of it, and the insights that Dr. King brought to that movement that are still very applicable today. And then we'll get into what the Poor People's Campaign and National Call for Revival, for Moral Revival looks like today in the country and in New York State in particular. So in 1967 and 68, Dr. King and the folks he was working with were kind of grappling with the limits of the civil rights movement. These major legislative victories had happened, but King was very aware as he traveled around the country that African Americans were still facing major challenges, and that the civil rights movement had integrated Black Americans into a society that had a lot of problems, right? So this is a quote from a speech he gave to his staff in 1967 in May. He said, "Now, when we see that there must be a radical redistribution of economic and political power, then we see that for the last 12 years we have been in a reform movement. After Selma and the Voting Rights Bill, we moved into a new era, which must be an era of revolution." Whoops. A quote from a couple months later, "We must not consider it unpatriotic to raise basic questions about our national character. For the evils of racism, poverty, and militarism to die, a new set of values must be born. Our economy must become more person-centered than property-centered and profit-centered. Our nation must depend more on its moral power than on its military power." Dr. King, of course, was a preacher and a pastor, and so he brought to this work this moral and values lens. And that the civil rights movement had challenged some of the values underpinning our society, but not these deepest values of capitalism, right? That he was seeing a society that was focused on making money and exploiting people, and that was protecting that way of life through military power that was killing poor people at the time in East Asia. And so he believed that getting at the heart of this was really about talking differently about the values of our society. That actually, if as a society we can agree that we want to be a person-centered society, that that's what we want to privilege above all else, then we have to decide that in order to get us to behave that way. And that the country currently wasn't then and now was not set up that way. So I have one more quote that I want to go through, which has become a really central quote to those of us who are doing organizing with the Poor People's Campaign about kind of the idea and premise behind that campaign. So I'm going to read it first and then pull out a few points from it. So this is from the Massey Lectures in 1967, the end of 1967. He says, "The dispossessed of this nation, the poor, both white and Negro, live in a cruelly unjust society. They must organize a revolution against the injustice, not against the lives of the persons who are their fellow citizens, but against the structures through which the society is refusing to take means which have been called for and which are at hand to lift the load of poverty. The only real revolutionary, people say, is a man who has nothing to lose. There are millions of poor people in this country who have very little or even nothing to lose. If they can be helped to take action together, they will do so with a freedom and a power that will be a new and unsettling force in our complacent national life." So I think this is a very profound statement, and I want to pull a few ideas out of it. And one is this second word, the dispossessed of this nation. What does anybody have kind of a thought that comes to mind? What does dispossessed infer? Yeah. What was that? Displacement? Yeah. It speaks to something that's come up a bunch already today, right? That people are poor because things have been taken from them. And when we go back to the founding history of this country, it starts with the taking of land from indigenous people and the murder and genocide of indigenous people. Native Americans aren't poor today because there's something wrong with Native Americans. They've been dispossessed. What is theirs was taken from them. The same is true when we look at the history of chattel slavery. And in different ways, the same is true when you look at a lot of poor white communities and the history of immigrants from Europe as well arriving in this country. That it's a story of people being dispossessed of what they had, as well as the dispossession of people's land and labor being exploited, so that people who are working are not adequately receiving or benefiting from the profit and the fruits of their labor. And then he says we live in a cruelly unjust society. And I don't know if we have to spend much time talking about that, because I think you all are pretty familiar with the cruelty that people experience living in poverty. The cruelty of knowing that there's a cancer treatment available to you, but not being able to access it. So one other thing that I think is really important to point out here is this line that we have to organize a revolution against the structures through which the society is refusing to take means which have been called for and which are at hand to lift the load of poverty. And to me, the key insight from that sentence is that if we didn't have the resources or the technology to give everybody a decent standard of living, then there wouldn't really be a moral problem with poverty. The reason that it's a moral crisis is that we actually have the resources and we have the wherewithal to be able to provide a decent, good standard of living for everyone, to eradicate poverty, and the structures are preventing that from happening. It's refusing to take means which have been called for and which are at hand. And then this last piece of it is about who has to be at the forefront of such a movement. And I think this is really, really important. And when we consider the time that King was talking about this in the late 60s, this was a time in our history when the white middle class was doing pretty well. When people talk about the increase in income inequality these days, a lot of those graphs start around this time period, right? As the time when wages and productivity were aligning, workers were making good wages, inequality was low. King knew at this time things were not good enough then. There were these massive poverty in urban ghettos. There was massive poverty in Appalachia, massive poverty on Native American reservations. And the reason that it's important that those most directly impacted are at the center of such a movement is because the interests of the poorest are aligned with things changing. My ancestors in the late 60s, my grandparents, were doing the best that my ancestors did, over the last few hundred years. They were doing pretty well. And if we were looking at their interests, we would have said things are okay in 1967. But it was the 40 million poor people in the United States at that time who knew that the system even then was not working, was cruelly unjust. And if we aren't looking to the quote-unquote bottom of society to see how we're doing, we're going to have this false sense of justice when it doesn't really exist. Does that make sense? So I'm going to go pretty quickly through the next part of this, but King's idea and the other organizers of this movement, and there were many women in particular who really made the original Poor People's Campaign happen, which is important to highlight because they often get overlooked. The plan was they were going to go to Washington, D.C. and have an encampment of thousands of poor folks across racial lines in the capital of the United States to demand the right to a basic standard of living. And King knew this was a very ambitious goal, and that it was going to require a higher level and degree of organization and training and development and unity than was necessary in the civil rights movement. Just one quote on that. He said, the desegregation of most public facilities, ending Jim Crow, was overdue for change. It wasn't necessary to build a widespread organization in order to win legislative victories. Where the spotlight illuminated the evil, a legislative remedy was soon obtained that applied everywhere. King knew once he started tackling these broader systems, it wasn't the case where you could just show something bad is happening and political leaders will be willing to support a solution, that this was going to require much greater organization across the country. So in December of 1967, the Southern Christian Leadership Convention announced that this campaign was going to happen. In March of 1968, they convened this very groundbreaking group of leaders from across the country who represented organized poor communities of poor whites, Mexican Americans, Puerto Ricans, organized faith communities, Native Americans, as well as organized labor and some anti-war groups. And this was kind of a core group that started building towards this. And just about 3 or 4 weeks later, King was assassinated. At the time, after he had come out against the Vietnam War, King had lost a lot of support. And so they were having a hard time raising money for the Poor People's Campaign initially. But once he was killed, there was this new sense of the campaign as being something to remember him by. And more support came in. And so in May of 1968, this encampment started. So you'll see kind of to the right of the National Mall, there's this kind of shanty town that was built. This is what it looked like on the ground. This is inside some of those A-frame huts that they built. There were about 3,000 people who lived in this city, and they were there for 42 days. This was a bakery. They had a school. They had their own zip code. They had a university there. They had a cultural space to share culture from around the country. And this is what Reverend Jesse Jackson, who was one of the leaders of this, said just a few months after it. He said, in Resurrection City, the poor whites began to see how they had been used as tools of the economic system to keep other minority groups in check. Their problems are basically the same as ours, a need for food, jobs, medicine, and schools. However, they were given police rights over people of color, a plan which satisfies their sick egos but does not deal with any of their basic problems. It was in our wallowing together in the mud of Resurrection City that we were allowed to hear, to feel, and to see each other for the first time in our American experience. This speaks to, I think, what many people have looked at this, see as the most profound thing that came out of the original Poor People's Campaign, was this breaking down of this narrative and lifting up of a new narrative that poverty is something that affects people across races, that race has been used to obscure that truth and to keep people divided, and that there is a power in coming together. Resurrection City ended up being shut down by the DC police in June of that year, 42 days into the occupation. The campaign did manage to win some policy concessions around funding for things like Head Start and food programs, things like that. And it established these kind of connections that Jesse Jackson talks about. But it didn't build the kind of long-term organization that King knew was necessary. And it didn't achieve, the demands of guaranteeing Americans' right to things like housing and healthcare and jobs and income. So here we are today. For about 10 years now, a bunch of the organizations that are now involved in the kind of relaunch of the Poor People's Campaign have been talking about what it would look like to try to pick up this dream that Dr. King and others had 50 years ago. And so in 2017, the organizing started to kick off that has launched the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. Oh, whoops. I added a slide that isn't there. So just briefly, here in New York State, some folks in the room were part of a process called the Truth Commission on Poverty in New York State in 2017, including Suzanne from Cuba over here. We started doing 3 hearings in New York State, one in Cuba, which is like an hour south of here, in Allegheny County. We did one in Schenectady, out in the Capital Region, and one on Long Island, and collected testimony from just over 80 people about what they were grappling with in terms of poverty and racism and xenophobia, all kinds of structures that are barriers to people having a good life in New York State. And in October, released a report on that, October 2017, as part of a Poor People's Campaign mass meeting where the 2 co-chairs of the national campaign, Reverend William Barber and Reverend Liz Theo-Harris, were there, and that kind of kicked off organizing in New York State with a coordinating committee that has been working since then. Nationally, on the 50th anniversary of MLK announcing the Poor People's Campaign, folks gathered in DC last December 4th, 2017, to announce that we were going to do this launch of 40 days of action beginning last Mother's Day through June, where people in at least 25 state capitals would take coordinated direct action, including civil disobedience, together to really lift up the reality that these crises that King had talked about continue and are getting worse. And before the 40 days of action started, the national campaign put out this report called The Souls of Poor Folk, Auditing America 50 years after the Poor People's Campaign challenged racism, poverty, militarism, and our national morality. And I am going to kind of breeze through what this found. But basically that, both in the process we did in New York State, we actually had a Buffalo hearing a couple months after that, I think in December or January last year, which I know some folks were at. But both the process in New York State and the process nationally shows just how deep the crisis we're in is right now. We've already heard some of this stuff, so I'll go through it pretty quickly. But one of the things we've talked about that has come up earlier today is the inadequacy of the federal poverty line as a way of looking at who is really struggling. So what this uses is the supplemental poverty measure, which is a little more nuanced, and looking at people who are under 200% of that, which is a more realistic measure of how many people are really having a hard time making ends meet. And this is what it is nationally. About 34% of white folks, which is so the largest numerical number as we talked about, but a lower proportion. Over 60% of Black people, 65% of Latinx people, 41% of Asian people, and 52% of children in the country are poor or low income. In New York State, it is actually higher than the national average. We have just over half of New Yorkers are poor or low income, and that includes 66.67 New Yorkers of color. More than 2/3 New Yorkers of color are poor or low income, and 60% of children in New York State are poor or low income, which is higher than the national figures. There are over 1 million New Yorkers, even though we have expanded Medicaid and done things like that, who don't have health insurance. Nationally, 43% of folks who do have health insurance have trouble affording their deductibles. Here in New York State, funding for social services agencies is down by 1/3 just since Governor Cuomo was elected. Nationally, since welfare reform in '96, spending on welfare programs has plummeted. Only 23% of poor families with children get temporary assistance for needy families. 17% of the nation's homeless live in New York. That has also gone up hugely. And this is, of course, a national crisis, too, of rents going up faster than incomes and cuts to federal housing and reduction in public housing availability. Black New Yorkers are incarcerated at 8 times the rate of white New Yorkers, which is also a trend in the last 50 years of huge increase in mass incarceration. There's a 10-fold increase in prison spending and deportations in the past 40 years in the United States. And this was mentioned earlier too, but up to 53 cents of every federal discretionary dollar goes to the military, and only 15 cents goes to anti-poverty programs. And then we've talked to you about growing inequality, which just briefly, you can see on this chart here, it's worse in New York State and New York City than the rest of the country. So that in 2015, in New York City, 41% of all income went to the top 1%. And in New York State, 32% of all income went to the top 1%. So this is what we're up against. Did the videos work? Okay, so I'm gonna show briefly what it looks like for the Poor People's Campaign to launch in the last year.
We must be honest about the foundations of the political and economic systems we call America. I love America because of her potential, but I know that America will never even get close to being a more perfect nation until we are honest about the politics of rejection.
I want to tell you about some of the leaders who are building the Poor People's Campaign. Callie Greer from Selma, Alabama, who had to bury her daughter, Venus, because she didn't have health care.
I'm here today to share my daughter's Venus's story. Venus discovered a small lump in her breast and she wasn't insured. Venus had to be approved for every prescription and every piece of medical equipment that she needed. I'm standing here today in solidarity with the Poor People's Campaign because no one should have to bury their child in America because they don't have health care insurance.
I'm 46 years old. I've lived in poverty here in West Virginia every day of my life. And I'm working. I am a working poor with a bachelor's degree. I'm doing the best I can with what I have.
I'm a second-generation fast food worker, and I've experienced the cycle of poverty firsthand. Growing up, I watched my mother endure long hours of back-breaking labor, doing everything she could to feed me and my sisters. My employer barely pays me enough to pay rent and utilities, let alone with the medical expenses with my mother.
I worked 41 years in the coal mines. I have black lung, and it's just unfathomable what these poor coal miners have to go through in order to get what they have worked for and deserve.
I'm a Vietnam veteran. My only chance of going to college was joining the Army.
It was one thing to know that you didn't have water and you couldn't afford your water. It's a whole nother to find out that they shut off your entire community and none of you matter.
But when I lost my housing, health care, and income all at the same time, I was terrified, panicked.
Hi, my name is Pamela Roach. I'm from Downs County, Alabama, and I live in a mobile home with my 2 kids. And I got raw sewage. I don't have no money on power. And I have to travel back and forth to Birmingham to take my daughter with the CPAP machine. Don't have a car and don't have no way to take her.
This is the largest encampment in Aberdeen. There's about 1,000 people in a town of 16,000 who are homeless.
In my community, we were all shut off for the day because none of us could afford our water bills. In the past, my family wasn't able to afford electricity in the winter. It was very hard on all of us.
This wall, this is sin of the highest order.
When there are 38 million poor children when 60% of African Americans are poor, when 65% of Latinx are poor, when 40% of Asians are poor, when there are 67 million poor white people, we must say, this is not right.
And there's a second one. Yeah. Thanks.
Our brothers and sisters are sleeping on the streets. For a country this rich to have so many people poor, it's immoral and it's wrong.
Our backs are against the wall and we got no choice but to push.
Followed that breaking news in Albany where a large group of protesters have moved into the street.
Washington Avenue between City Hall and Lark Street closed down.
Protesters with the Poor People's Campaign of Indiana.
2 o'clock on the East Coast, 2 o'clock in the middle, 2 o'clock on the West Coast. A wave, and the historians tell us it's never happened before.
Our communities, Muslim communities who have joined the Poor People's Campaign, you can count on us.
Our democracy is in trouble.
Our democracy is in trouble.
And we come to demand.
Second warning.
Because it's crucial that we make ourselves heard. No one is listening. We write letters, we make calls, no one is listening. So we gotta find a way to make ourselves heard.
We are the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And we are here. We are poor. We are clergy. And we're here to say to our nation's capital and to the highest court in this land that everybody has a right to live. Everybody has a right to learn. Everybody has a right to love. Everybody has a right to living wages. Everybody has a right to vote. Everybody has a right to thrive in this society.
Everybody say, oh!
I believe that we will win. I believe that we will win. I believe that we will win. Freedom fighter and he taught us how to fight.
The poor and their clergy. We read Article 6 of the Kentucky State Constitution that says we have a right to free assembly.
We are demanding that we stop the war on our poor.
There will be a movement that will break through the con and bring people together to save the heart and the soul of this democracy and this world.
So that was last in June. I know a bunch of folks in the room made their way to Albany. Raise your hand if you're in Albany. All right, so we had 6 weeks of action. 40 states ended up participating all around the country. And the idea was to kind of plant a flag in the ground and say, this is what the crisis is in this country. These are our demands. And then to go back into our states and start really doing grassroots organizing. And that's where we are now. So just briefly, here we go. A couple of the key principles of this campaign. One important one is that it's nonpartisan. The reality is that neither of the 2 main political parties in this country are working in the interests of the poorest. And that if we can get outside of that, a language and frame that divides people into Democrat and Republican, we are more able to talk about the real issues affecting people and build that unity across region and across race and across issue that we really need. The third point is one of the most important ones, that we believe that these systems, that the Poor People's Campaign draws on the triple evils that King talked about, poverty, racism, and militarism, and then adds to that ecological devastation because that's such a crisis in our time. But really believe that you can't attack any one of those systems without looking at how they're all connected and talking about all of them because of how intertwined they are. And that in order to really effectively organize, we have to do it that way. We have to do it cross-issue, intersectionally, or we're just not going to be able to build the kind of power that we need. And then finally, as we talked about a little earlier, this was part of that quote that we talked about from Dr. King, that we have to be based in the leadership of the most directly impacted. And it's not just about the most directly impacted, right? That we believe that this movement is really about the conditions that the whole society is facing. A study a couple years showed that 80% of Americans will experience poverty in their lifetime. So just because we're not currently impacted by poverty does not mean it does not affect our future or our family, or that we haven't experienced in the past. That this isn't about it's affecting somebody else, but that these conditions, the poor are kind of the vanguard of society experiencing a broken system that we're all harmed by. And so it's important to think not that we're allies to some people who are impacted over there, but to really intimately understand how, although we're impacted differently, we're in this fight because we are all impacted. And we all have an interest and a stake in building a world that is just for everybody in it. So I want to stop in a minute and get into some discussion. But first, I just want to talk a little bit about where the campaign is at in New York State right now. So we have three main goals of this second phase of the campaign. The first phase was what you saw in the video of people mobilizing to their state capitals and getting arrested and protesting. The first goal is to build power by uniting the poor and dispossessed and connecting people in new ways across the state and country. So as a campaign in New York State, we're really concerned about making sure that we have leaders and activities happening in every part of the state, because we know that politically, the divisions between New York City and the rest of us, or the divisions between rural areas and urban areas, have been used to keep policies that would be good for us from passing. And so if we're not organizing in a way that unites those communities, we're going to be beaten again by that divide and conquer tactic. So that's really important. By building power, we think that our power isn't going to come from money. And at this point, it's not going to come from electing nice people either. Power is going to come from having people organized and united. So the more people that share a common vision, share a common understanding of what is wrong and what we need, and have relationships with one another and connected, that's what power is going to look like. The more we have that, the more power we have to change what's happening. The second goal is to shift the moral narrative by shifting the narrator. And we've talked about this a bunch today, the fact that a lot of people have these very erroneous understandings of poverty and why people are poor, that blame poor people and obscure the systemic roots of poverty and racism. And so we think that shifting that narrative, that changing the public understanding, is a really critical piece to make the policy changes that we need possible. And so, you know, those videos are part of that, right? Like showing the stories of people, how they're impacted, showing people taking bold action together, and putting these facts out there, that this is part of the work we have to do to shift people's kind of common sense understanding of what's going on. And then third, we want to influence policies and elections. We do not believe that change is going to happen right now by electing the right people. For the most part, the right people aren't running for office. We don't see them on the ballot, with some exceptions. But when we build the kind of movement and public pressure that can force whoever's sitting in those elected offices to behave a certain way, that is when we have power over the policies that happen at a government level. And we also are realistic about the stage that we're in. This particular campaign is just starting, is just building, and so we don't have the ability right now to win some of our biggest demands. But we also see that small victories and small wins can be part of building power. It can be part of mobilizing people and identifying new leaders and building unity that will create a larger and larger movement that can win bigger and bigger demands. I love this quote, but I'm going to skip it. So this is a picture from actually just a week and a half ago. We did our first coordinated action since the 40 days, and we had actions happening on Long Island and in Troy in the capital region, on Wall Street in New York City, and in Elmira. And there was a solidarity action in Buffalo too, but it wasn't like a rally like this. And we were talking about the state budget, which is being negotiated now. In Long Island, they were outside of a juvenile detention center. In Elmira, they were outside of the Chemung County Jail. We were outside of Rensselaer County Social Services in Troy, and they were on Wall Street in New York City to talk about this larger narrative about how our state is not investing in the things that would end poverty and racism and militarism and environmental destruction in our state, but rather is investing in policies that lock up kids and adults. They're underinvesting in the social services that we need, and yet in New York City, and particularly on Wall Street, we have an abundance of wealth in this state that could be used to level the playing field and lift everybody up. So this is one of the things that we're going to keep doing, is taking action and protesting around policies. But another is really to try to identify and develop and unite a core of leaders that are representing all these different parts of the state. So actually next week, a group of about 30 folks will be coming from all over the state and actually starting in Buffalo, and then taking a trip down to Geneseo to meet with some farm workers and talk about the campaign to get driver's licenses for undocumented immigrants. Then we're going to go to Elmira and have another kind of truth commission, a poor people's hearing, where we hear about experiences in Elmira. We're going to go up to Auburn and look at the history of the Underground Railroad there, and then end up in Syracuse. And this is part of a strategy to both develop kind of a common understanding and strategy and just unite some of the volunteer leaders who are really building this campaign who come from around the state. So last thing, we have committees kind of in formation or existing right now all over the state. There are folks from Western Southern Tier and Buffalo in this room. Oh, and I guess I'm from the capital region. Yeah, so we're hoping to just keep growing this so that, you know, going into next year and years beyond, we can be even more active in talking about the kind of policy changes and things that are needed in New York and at the federal level. So there's much more to say, but I want to hear what you all think and what questions you have, and have a bit of conversation before we move on.
So do you think it's actually possible that we can change the structures to make it so that poverty isn't so necessary in our economy or in our understanding? Because like as a society, we don't value poor people. We think that they're They're necessary to do the services for us, but they're not necessary for our existence. So do you think it's actually possible for us to change?
Yes. Yes. I do. Not that it's not inevitable that it will. It won't be easy, but it's definitely possible, because it's the only thing that is getting in the way is, which is what we've kept saying today, right, is political will. And political will shifts. That's how, when the abolition movement started, it was inconceivable that slavery would end in this country. And it took decades of organizing and also other conditions shifting around it. But it's definitely possible to make those huge shifts in understanding and values and in politics. But in terms of the actual technical challenge, that is very possible. And so if we can get this other piece, it can happen.
Thank you for the presentation. Every time I see the videos, it takes me right back to being there. And I was a delegate from Western New York, and I was proud to be there. And I'm still proud that I'm part of this movement, because it is a people's campaign. And that's what makes it so vital. I just wanted to give a word of encouragement, because we have been working at this for a prolonged period of time now. It's not something that just happened. It was an action and it fizzed out and it died. And so it's capturing attention all the time. I can say for me, my pastor, I talked to you about my pastor, traditional black church, my pastor's not with it, right? But now my pastor's watching some of the videos because he hears us talking about it all the time. And he's gone back and looked at it and he's like, yeah, that's kind of sort of cool. It's catching, but it is something that we have to know, we change the narrative. We change how things are done structurally against poor people in this country. And it's when we get together and we get our voice and stand up and say, we've had enough of this, that we get our power back.
I just remind myself, and I can't think of the name of the book that I read, but the abolition movement took over 100 years. It's hard to say that out loud, but it's real.
I just wanted to ask a little bit more about the bus tour that's coming. I know that it's been in the planning stages. So how is it being established? Who's going, and where will they be coming from? And so will they? And they'll stop at Syracuse, and then go back to all their home territory. So if you want to talk a little bit more about that, that would be wonderful.
I think actually others in the room know a little more even on logistics than I do. But basically, some representatives from each committee around the state and a few folks from other parts of the country I think are going to be there too. And most of it will be kind of like relationship building and education among that core of leaders. And then there will be a few public events. The only one that I know for sure is Elmira, the Poor People's Hearing.
I just had more of an organizer question, just how do you get what are your strategies for getting more people involved into the campaign, Ben? Because I know someone that's surrounded by people that care a lot about issues. A lot of people are eager to talk, but not eager to take action. So, and it's hard to take action when you're a busy person, but we're all busy, and it's just what has your strategies been to combat kind of that apathy, even with people that care, but just to getting them be okay, you care, now you really have to take action. How do you kind of do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a lot to say about that. I think a few things. One is to kind of think of the ladder of engagement as kind of organizer talk for how, and valuing even the most basic levels of engagement, and that the more people you have on the lowest level, the more people you have on the top level. So some of it is just you have to reach as many people as possible in order to find the folks who really are willing to put a lot of time and energy into it. And I do think even engaging on social media is something, right? It helps shift the narrative in that way. But I think one of the things that has been helpful is those hearings, like the truth commissions and the hearings, and really going into it with a sense of humility and really honestly wanting to hear what the community has to say and hear the insights and the struggles that people are coming out of, and trying to always make that space for folks so that, and also to try to build a sense of community as much as we can. Like singing is a big part of the campaign, and kind of building just sort of a culture of community that I think makes people feel connected and want to stay engaged. But it's definitely not easy. Yeah, probably some folks here too could answer why they got involved and kept coming back.
We actually have one question here. Hi, my name is Helen. I noticed that you're like a priest, right, a preacher, or I'm sorry, reverend. I'm sorry, and also like Martin Luther King, he was also a reverend. So like it's like what I've been seeing like for the past couple of years is not really a lot of representation through maybe like the church of being involved in the movement like against poverty, especially since like I've had an experience where I heard somebody within the church saying that. Especially after I think it was Hurricane Maria happened, and they said that people are blaming the church, but what about taxes? What are taxes for? And then you even just mentioned that a lot of the tax dollars, even in the prison system, it goes towards the military, it doesn't go towards, to help relieve poverty. So do you think that the church, because that's the only because I'm Christian, so that's the only place of worship that I would know or speak from. Do you think the church has like a bigger role to play when it comes to poverty and also being inclusive towards everybody who also is affected by poverty?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the churches and other faith communities end up bearing a lot of the burden of responding to poverty through like food pantries and things like that, which is a really important service that churches provide. I think what we think is really important is that, not to confuse charity work or survival, meeting people's survival needs as fixing the problem. And that sometimes faith communities get sort of into this lane where they think they're just supposed to be providing for people's immediate needs and not getting into the lane of addressing and fixing the underlying structures. And, I think part of this campaign, because it is drawing and seeking support from a lot of faith communities, is to bring into that both. It is a moral imperative for faith communities based on our values to act about in relation to changing structures, and that there's a role as gathering places where a lot of directly impacted folks come. How can church leaders and just faith institutions be part of helping, in King's words, helping the poor to take action together, and shifting away from just meeting people's needs, but how can we also use our resources and our organizations to help the poor to take action together?
I just wanted to add, because you invited as far as like, why are we involved or et cetera. I would say I'm Vicki Ross, I'm the director at the Western New York Peace Center. So the Western New York Peace Center was actually started as part of Dr. King's Clergy and Laity Against the War. And one of the things that we work on is peace through actually our mission statement, peace through justice at home and abroad, and have these 9 task forces, et cetera. And so both from the Peace Center perspective, from that holistic view that all of our issues are connected, we've been using hashtag Unite the Struggles as well as hashtag Poor People's Campaign. That connectedness and connecting all the issues is so key. And I would say especially for us here who aren't all social workers, but certainly on Social Workers Month and social workers organizing this, social work takes its person and environment. So that holistic view is just so critical, and that movement building is now. So we're as some say, Jim Anderson says, we're in the intersection. I think we're in the intersection. We need to be making those changes together and uniting the struggles. So we can't thank you enough for your leadership and our shared leadership in really making it happen, and it's happening.
So in the interest of time, we have one more question and one online question, and that will be it.
I don't have a question. I just wanted to make a comment for Emily. When she asked about what we're doing here in the Buffalo region, my name is Sophia Howard Johnson, and I am an educator. I work in Buffalo Public Schools. I also am a labor worker. My union is NICET, and my other union is BTF. So we get out and work in community activities and make coalitions with groups such as the Poor People Campaign, and we support them. So the actions that we've been doing some actions here in Buffalo, and the one that's coming, we did one where we put baby dolls at Schumer's office with signs that said "Health Care for All." I don't even want to say the man's name.
Scheminger.
So I mean, but we've been doing various actions, and the one that we're coordinating now is that we're going to invite some of our fellow workers to come in to our city, and we're housing them, providing housing and meals for them while we break bread together, and we're going to be hosting them and talking to them about our regional area, what issues we have in Buffalo. We're giving them history about Harriet Tubman, because this is where the Underground Railroad has been established. So we are a small core group, but we're unsettled. And we fight hard. So we're looking for more people to join our cause. So we just wanted to let you know that. If you're interested, Silver can give you the information about our Facebook. So I'll let her do that.
Sorry, we just got an email, so I was looking for the exact address for the email. But if you go to facebook.com, PPCWNY, PPC-WNY, or just look Poor People's Campaign, Western New York, you know, we have a region here. We're going to be having meetings, open meetings soon. We were just trying to get everyone who has been involved and get some sort of structure. But, you know, you can get involved with us, become a part of whatever leadership committees, whatever you would like to get involved with, make your voice heard. Just come out and be a part if you would like.
Okay, so we're going to do this last question really quickly. Do you feel that doing away with the Electoral College would help decrease voter suppression in poverty-stricken communities?
I can speak for myself that, yes, I think it would.
Okay. So thank you, Reverend McNeill. It was a fantastic talk. So I think everybody is ready to act and mobilize. So we'll have like a 10-minute break before our last session. So, and then if you haven't done it, so please sign up for our registration form list. We need that for budget, you know, like reimbursement. We will be in big trouble if you do not sign up.